Hello, I'm Douglas Murray, here for Unheard, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Jordan Peterson. So Jordan, we've been spending some time together recently on stage talking, among other things, about God. But today I wondered if we could pivot to politics, and to one thing in particular which has been on my mind and which I know has been on your mind, which is the issue of where politics goes wrong, where the right goes wrong in politics and where the left goes wrong in politics. We should probably start with the right, but we can see some of that more clearly. The cliff edge is more vertiginous, it seems. What are your thoughts on that currently, of where the right of politics gets to go wrong?
Well, I think that we have been able to box in the more unfortunate elements of the right. And that's probably a consequence mostly of moral deliberations undertaken after World War II. So we've seemed to have come to a pretty general consensus, I would say, that claims of ethnic or racial superiority place you outside the realm of acceptable political discourse. That's that cliff place where dialogue degenerates into conflict, inevitably. I think the right, the classic errors of the right are to fail to attend sufficiently to the tendency for hierarchies to degenerate into corruption because of willful blindness and rigidity. And of course, that's something that the left takes the right to task for, generally speaking. So there's the hard line, which is ethnic identity as a mark of superiority, and then there's a looser line where there's also error. I think the right errs in the same way that the left does when they play identity politics. So, generally the way that we're conceptualizing the political landscape is right to left as a distribution. But there's another axis, which is probably collectivist versus individualist. And there's collectivist left-wingers and there's collectivist right-wingers. And insofar as the left-wingers and the right-wingers are collectivist, then they're wrong. And you see that on the right with their claims of ethnic and national superiority, say.
Do you hear some of that coming back more, or?
I don't know. The thing is, there's a lot of noise in the press, especially on the left, especially as you move towards the radical left, about the alt-right. But I have a hard time putting my finger on exactly who these alt-right people are. If you look at the radical left, it's obvious that they have a stranglehold, I would say, on the universities, especially the humanities and social sciences, and that one of the consequences of that is that the doctrine that those entities has been producing is spilling over into society to a large degree. And there's a lot of noise about the alt-right, but I can't figure out who the alt-right people are.
Has anyone met them?
Well, what happens in the United States, I think, is that anything that smacks of support for Trump is immediately associated with the alt-right. But the situation in the United States is way more complicated than that, because the Americans have been split 50% Democrat and 50% Republican, like as close to 50% as it can possibly be, for 4 decades. And so I don't see that the election of Trump indicates the rise of something approximating even right-wing populism in the United States. It's more complicated in Europe because the border and immigration issues are much hotter topics in Europe. And I do think that it seems to me that there is a rise of ethno-nationalist parties on the farther reaches of the right in Europe.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, but it's so difficult to get accurate information now, perversely enough, that it's very difficult to evaluate.
One of the strange things about the whole alt-right thing is the extent to which it's a way to avoid facing up to the reality that half the country voted for Donald Trump. It seems to be some kind of coping mechanism. And I noticed a little while ago when you were doing Bill Maher's show, you mentioned when you got onto the panel bed that perhaps you went down a level underneath the one
Yeah.
that the panel wanted to talk about, which was just riffing on the awfulness of Donald Trump. And I think you rightly pointed out that we can all play the game of who can be rudest about Donald Trump, but you tried to go down to the level of what would you do if you took the president away from the people who voted for him by indictment or whatever it would be, whatever the mechanism. And they seemed utterly baffled by your question.
Well, they were stunned at the fact that someone would pose that question. I mean, I sat there and I thought about that for a long time, whether I would ask that question, because I knew I was jumping out of the game that they were all playing. It's like, well, you have to live with these people. And do you really think they're all so stupid? Is that really your theory about why Trump was elected? And the whole Maher phenomena is quite interesting, because he interviewed Ben Shapiro a while after that, and took everyone, including Shapiro, to task for the absolute stupidity of the catastrophe of Trump, without ever reflecting on the fact that clearly in the United States the liberal left lost the election. Trump didn't win. Everyone thought Hillary was going to win. She had it in the bag. And if she wouldn't have played identity politics, she only needed 70,000 additional votes. If she wouldn't have played identity politics, she would have won. And Maher, when he went after Shapiro, took no responsibility whatsoever of the failures of the liberal left. It was all, well, the stupidity of the people who voted for Trump. And my sense, because I've talked to many, many people who voted for Trump, is that it isn't like people on the center right and the right, the Republican end of the distribution, were overwhelmingly impressed with what Trump had to offer. But they were willing to take, that was the risk that they were willing to take. And it was partly because they're so disenfranchised by the identity politics that the Democrats have descended into. And they have nothing else to offer the Democrats. It's identity politics or nothing.
Do you think, because to an extent, I mean, the Trump Brexit phenomenon is often uncomfortably put together. There are lots of things that make them different, but one of the things that makes them similar is this attempt by people to push away any attempt to explain what has happened, to come up with reason after reason other than the possibility that half of the people have a different view of politics. And there seems to be some kind of coping mechanism going on that to keep pushing away that realization that your own side has got some fundamental misunderstanding.
Yeah, well, it's easier. And I think it's very easy for people who don't want to evaluate their own beliefs to assume that everything that the other side is saying is a consequence of their personal moral failings and their ignorance and their malevolence, basically. And it's not helpful. Especially, it's not helpful. I particularly think it's unhelpful in the United States, because it isn't obvious to me that the underlying dynamic has really changed that much, given that it's been 50-50 for 20 years, and it was 50-50 in the last election. So the alt-right may be very, very hard to pin down or find, and anyone who would be a member of it would be able to get a lot of publicity, and sort of has in some ways. And a couple of people who you'd identify have never had more coverage than they have by being identified in this way. But I sense there's something, there are things that are murmuring under the discussion on the right. It seems to me that me at any rate, very, very uncomfortable, very worried. And the one that I started to notice a little while ago was probably in the last year or so. It was the increase of people, Q&A, sometimes, meet and greet sort of things after speeches, where I found that almost always there was at least one person who asked me about IQ. Mm-hmm. Now that had never happened until about a year or two ago. I never got asked about that. For a long time I sort of said, it's not my thing, I don't know about it, I don't, that's why I haven't discussed it. But there was always this sort of thing of, you should look into it, and I could never quite put my finger on why I was uncomfortable about it, other than the fact that I knew that somebody who raised it first was somebody I was innately suspicious of. Well, there is a danger on the right, that the identity politics danger, because the right will play identity politics different than the left. The leftist theory is, well, we should all segregate ourselves into our identity groups, and then those who are the oppressor groups should repent and feel terrible for their oppressive acts and step aside. And that's one way of playing identity politics. But another way of playing identity politics is, to hell with you. I will pick my identity group based on race or ethnicity, whatever it is that I feel most comfortable with, since that's the game, and then I'll play to win. Right. And my sense is that there will be plenty of people attracted to the identity politics game that you win. And, you know, the people who've gone after me from the right wing have basically gone after me for exactly that reason. They say Peterson stresses individuality and individual responsibility, but fails entirely to appreciate the fact that we do manifest ourselves in groups, which is exactly the same thing that the radical leftists argue, and that it's necessary for those of us who wish to preserve our culture, etc., to group together in our homogenous group and act collectively to, what would you say, take our territory back, something like that. And that's very much a fascist perspective, fundamentally. But it's if the fundamental game is identity politics, it isn't obvious why the logical choice is to lose. So now, you know, when I discuss this, I tell people that the whole idea that you should view the world through the lens that makes your collective identity paramount is a pathological game, no matter who's playing it, because it produces a reversion to divisive tribalism, and small, diverse tribes of people mostly fight.
But why do you think the IQ and the IQ differentials question has become a sort of such a edge issue for some people? Why that one?
Well, the IQ literature in general is a what would you call it? It's an ethical nightmare. Sure. I think that the right-wingers who are using IQ as a lever use it to buttress claims of ethnic and group superiority. Yeah. And of course, that's partly why the left, the possibility that that might occur is partly why the left has objected to, we could say, IQ research since, well, probably for the last 30 years. It's interesting though, you know, because when the IQ tests were first developed, they were developed in France, and then they were used in England for years by left-leaning parties to screen, and this was part of a conscious plan to produce upward social mobility, idea that you could objectively assess intellectual prowess, allowed the selection of, let's call them deserving poor, using the Victorian or the Edwardian terminology, that you could identify people who were of great intellectual promise amongst the working class and pull them up into the educated middle class or elite, and that would be of benefit to them and everyone else. But the problem with IQ tests is that they do produce group differences. Yeah. And that's unbelievably complicated and horrible. Yeah. And it's complicated because it isn't obvious how you should group people if you're going to do group analysis of IQ. So for example, there's more genetic diversity among Africans than there is among the remaining, all the other human populations. So exactly who you put people in the bin of, how you put people in the bin of Black, Caucasian, and Asian, let's say, which are generally regarded as the three major racial groups, that's far from obvious. And so that's a basic scientific conundrum that's right at the bottom of the IQ problem. But if you use the typical groupings, you do get ethnic differences. And that starts to become extremely problematic, because the question then is why? Right. And with the answer to that is we don't know. And some of them, like, so you think, well, the most commonly discussed ethnic differences is the propensity for people who are defined as Black, the way that Americans define Black, to perform more poorly on standardized tests. And so then the accusation is that the tests are somehow biased, or that there's socioeconomic factors at work, or perhaps at the bottom of the desirability hierarchy that there are biological factors at work, and no one has nailed any of that down. If you give that data credence, then it leaves you with the terrible question of what do you do about those differences and how do you conceptualize them? But and it can also be used as a justification for a kind of racial hierarchy.
Yeah.
But then if you reverse it, you see the reverse problem emerging with the issue of Ashkenazi Jews, because they're overrepresented in most positions of competence, let's say, and authority. Radically overrepresented, especially at the top. And unless you're willing to posit something like IQ differential that will account for it, you have to come up with a conspiratorial theory. Exactly. And so with IQ, this is the thing about IQ research, is that no matter how you interpret it, you're basically screwed. Yeah. And it's partly because the facts of the world don't necessarily line up with our a priori moral desires. Because what we would really like would be for there to be no important differences in important function across all the groups that people are put in or identify with. But it doesn't work out that way.
One of the problems I've been thinking about it for a while, it's such an edge issue, and it's, as I say, I sort of fear it coming in somehow to a much more mainstream position unless there's an attitude taken towards it. Obviously it seems that the left has been trying for a long time, and other people have, to just keep it away, as you say, since the bell curve at least, and for time before that, to just keep it away as a discussion. It's obviously bubbling away, and so it seems to me you have to find some attitude towards it, other than
well, the fundamental problem is that the best predictor of long-term life outcome is IQ. Right. That's a real problem. Now, it's not that great a predictor. That's the first thing, is that if you're optimistic about IQ, you'd say that it predicts about 25% in the variance of long-term life outcome. And then other factors like conscientiousness, which is the next best predictor, it's a big 5 trait, accounts for about 9%, 10%, something like that. So the two best predictors combined only account for 35% of the difference in life outcome, leaving 65% for other factors, which is quite a lot. So those factors could include things like prejudice and systemic bias and so forth. But a lot of it's also luck and health and all the things that determine whether you fall off the edge of the world. The problem with IQ is that there's no damn way it's going away. And people say, well, IQ, it's not really a good measure of intelligence. It's like, sorry, people, this is where it gets truly ugly, because there is no phenomena in social sciences, period, that is on firmer statistical and conceptual footing than IQ. We know, and there's no phenomena that's more robust. No matter if you give people tasks that involve abstraction, if you give people a set of tests that assess abstraction, and then you measure their average score on the set of tests of abstraction, and then you rank order them, you have an IQ measure. That's all you have to do. It's not any real different. The measure is no different than your average performance across a set of tasks that require abstraction.
The problem, as I say, you sort of come back to each time, is the manner in which people want to use the data, or the ends to which they wish to sort of find it useful. And the first thing is obviously that it would seem to me to be obviously becoming a way in which some people on the right are trying to come back with very ugly ideas and very ugly prejudices of their own. The second is that it strikes me that the overemphasis on IQ by some people, I'm not saying by everybody, I'm not saying to neglect the literature, but that the overemphasis, among other things, makes this error of thinking that intelligence, as it were, the only important trait in human beings.
Well, I think the problem there is not exactly so much the definition of intelligence as the only important what would you say, defining characteristic of human beings, but to conflate intelligence with value or moral virtue.
Yeah, and worth.
Right, yes, worth. That's the really pernicious element, is that there's an underlying assumption that if there are differences in people with regards to IQ, somehow there are differences in their worth. Yes. And there are differences in their economic worth, but that doesn't mean that there are differences in their intrinsic worth. And that's something that has to be very, very carefully laid out.
The novelist Ian McEwan once said that all readers have to at some point contend with the awkward fact that some of the nicest people they know have never read a book.
Right. Well, okay. So let's go into the IQ thing more terribly. So IQ tests produce ethnic differences. And then you might say, well, that constitutes a sign of bias. It's like, okay, if that was true, then IQ tests would when you're using them to predict real life performance within groups, they would underpredict the real life performance of the ethnic groups where IQ scores are lower, but they don't. So there's no evidence of bias in terms of prediction. Now you could say, well, that means the whole system is rigged. The IQ system is rigged and the life outcome system is rigged. And that would be basically the position of the egalitarian left. It's like, fair enough, that could be the case. But there's another ugly thing that lurks here too, is, well, let's say that you decide that the way that you're going to deal with the fact that there are ethnic differences in IQ in the literature is that you're going to throw IQ out completely and not bother with it. And sometimes universities are starting to do this because they're throwing away tests like the SAT. And people say that these standardized tests are not IQ tests, but that's because they don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because they are absolutely and clearly IQ tests. Because any test that tests a reasonable set of questions of abstraction that you get a total score from or an average is an IQ test. So people can wave their hands about that all they want, but that just means they don't know what the hell they're talking about. All right, so let's say we decide just to scrap the idea of IQ. Well, here's a problem. As our society, this is actually a problem that Charles Murray and Herrnstein talked about in the bell curve. It was never really mentioned, though, because it's actually an argument that the left should be very sensitive to. We are producing our hierarchies are increasingly IQ predicated. Yeah. And so what's happening is that the dispossessed that the left hypothetically is concerned about and genuinely concerned about, to the degree that there's genuine and proper engagement on the left, because it's the proper role of the left, is that if you don't take differences in cognitive function into account, you are going to miss what's going to dispossess most people over the next 30 or 40 years. Because we're producing a cognitive hierarchy. And increasingly, the spoils of the hierarchy are going to people who are in the cognitive stratosphere, so to speak, especially because it's one thing to be really smart. It gives you an edge in a complex society, especially one that's changing very rapidly like ours. But if you're really smart and you know how to use a computer, you are so far ahead of people that it's like you're a member of a different species. And if you don't think that that's going to be the fundamental problem of the coming age, let's say, then you're not very awake.
I suppose just to wrap up this issue for the time being, the thing I've been trying to work out my own disturbance about this issue for a while, and I suppose I recently managed to hone it down to this, that it's not that I think that it should be ignored, I don't think it can be denied, but that I suppose one of the things that makes me so uncomfortable about the IQ thing is that I can foresee, if the people who are most interested in it keep pushing it like this, I see some terrible concatenation of nightmares, because of course this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's also, in my view, happening at a point when, let me put it this way, the concept of the sanctity of the individual, whether you define that in a religious context or in the kind of secular religious context in which some of us currently hold this idea, at the time in which the notion of the sanctity of the individual is sort of eroding in a society, the combination of that happening at the same time as an obsession with IQ in the century ahead of us just has the potential for a catastrophe of 20th century proportions. And that's the reason why I just fear that if this isn't dealt with in a reasonable way, it comes at us in the most unreasonable way imaginable somewhere down the line.
Well, I think that that's a genuine concern. That there's going to be elements of it that are going to come at us in an unreasonable way. I mean, look at what's happened at Harvard. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's happened there, and the Asians, of course, are the wild card in this whole enterprise, because the affirmative action policies in the U.S. hypothetically were set up, at least in part, to bring so-called minority, it's not like Asians are a minority, but to bring minority people
access to the university.
Sure, but it turns out that if you use unbiased selection processes, then you overselect for Asians. So you overselect for Asians and Jews. It's like, oh my God.
Which is why they're now discovering that Harvard has had to come up with these techniques to try to downgrade
Yeah,
Asians,
sure,
such as
sure.
downgrading them on
personality.
Personality.
Well, and the funny thing too is it's not that they're downgrading them on personality, because they don't use objective personality measures, which they could use. Because one of the things that's really cool about the Big Five, especially measures of conscientiousness, is measures of conscientiousness do not produce ethnic differences. So one of the ways of putting together a selection battery that's objective, let's say, which would mean both blind to peripheral characteristics such as race, but also capable of predicting the desired outcomes. So that's what I mean by objective, is to produce a battery of tests that blends cognitive assessment with genuine personality assessment. And actually, it's so interesting because in the American context, you're actually bound to do that by law if you're selecting employees, because you're bound to use the most valid and reliable current method of selection. That's instantiated into law. And the American Psychological Association has stated firmly that the proper way to do that is to use a balance of cognitive tests and personality tests. But virtually no one does that for all sorts of extremely complicated and absurd reasons. But then you might say, well, we can't use the cognitive tests because they produce ethnic differences, and you can moderate that by interleaving personality, which is one way of dealing with it. We're going to use something else. It's like, okay, you're going to use something else. Well, it turns out that whatever else you use is more biased than the thing you're fleeing from. And that's what's manifesting itself at Harvard. Well, we'll use our subjective judgment. And, the Harvard people have been hand-waving about the fact that their bloody admission criteria are so sophisticated that you can't capture them with mere quantitative analysis.
This is their latest one after trying to just make sure nobody had access to what they were actually doing.
That's right. We're so sophisticated that we couldn't possibly quantify it. It's like, that's not sophisticated, that's prejudice.
At every single stage, Harvard University in this case, that Asian students have brought, at every single stage, they've done everything they can to cover over the actual fact that they are themselves being biased on ethnic reasons in their selection.
Well,
it's an extraordinary sight.
Sure, and so what's happening is that wherever subjectivity is allowed to enter into the equation, the Asians are downgraded as a consequence of personality, which isn't personality. It's actually the subjective sense that the evaluators produce when they read through the applications and they know that the applicant is Asian.
And it wasn't even, without even meeting the applicant. Judging the person on racial characteristics without having met them.
Yes, and there's a variety of things that are appalling about that. And one of them, of course, is the denial of the opportunity to attend a top-tier university like Harvard for the students who were qualified to attend, the Asian students. But there's another element to this that's also equally pernicious, and in some sense more self-serving. Like, if you set up your society properly, and this is the equality of opportunity doctrine, it's in everyone's best interest to exploit the talented maximally, right? Because in every domain of productive endeavor, a small proportion of people do most of the productive work. And so you want to take advantage of those people, those 1 in 1,000 people or 1 in 10,000 people who are mathematically gifted, for example, or gifted in whatever way they happen to be gifted. And so if you don't select your top tier candidates, so let's say the Asian students in the case of Harvard, then society doesn't get a chance to exploit them properly and everyone ends up poorer. Apart from the fact that each individual doesn't get their opportunity, there's a social cost here too that's not trivial. And then, of course, the other issue is that the criteria are seen to be inequitable, because they actually are. And that produces a terrible amount of cynicism about the institutions themselves. So the horror of objective testing is that it's biased. Yes. And that the more profound horror is that no matter what you replace it with something that's even more biased. So it's like, well, good luck thinking your way out of that conundrum.
In your monk debate in Canada recently, you got into a fascinating subject, which I wanted to turn to, which is the question of, if we are in agreement on where the right goes wrong, racial difference being made the sole most important thing, exacerbation of such differences, and so on. The vertiginous fall that we can all identify that can happen to the extremes of the right. If we identify that, you, I think, quite rightly said to your debate opponents there, where is it that the left goes wrong? And rather like your conversation with the panel on Bill Maher about Trump voters, absolutely nobody was able to even understand what you were starting to get at, and nobody picked you up on it. So I wanted
that was a question that just went nowhere.
Just evaporated. And it seems to me that, and obviously we're speaking in London, we've had massive changes on the political left in this country in the last 2 years. This question of where the left goes wrong seems to me
a crucial question.
Absolutely vital.
It's absolutely crucial. Yeah, and it's a question that intellectuals in particular, I would say, are at terrible fault for not addressing over the last virtually 100 years. Because the intellectuals, roughly speaking, have been complicit in failure to define the excesses of the left.
Why is that?
Well, I think it's partly because intellectuals tend to be left-leaning. So the best predictor for leaning left is a trait called openness, which is associated to some degree with cognitive ability, but more importantly with creativity. And so left-leaning people don't like boundaries between things, and which is also why I think the left-leaning people can't draw boundaries within their own domain. They don't like borders, well, as we can certainly tell. I mean, they'd rather have the borders open. Well, why? Because the more open the borders are between things, the more opportunity there is for information flow. And left-leaning open people like information flow. They think, well, the net benefit of free information flow is positive. It's like, fair enough. But that doesn't mean that there should be no barriers between things, which is the conservative perspective. And because many of the forms of information, it's not only information that flows across open borders, it's all sorts of things that flow across open borders. And so, and things get muddy and confused if there's no conceptual differences between people. And so there's an argument between the right and the left about where the borders should be and how porous they should be. And that's an argument that always has to occur. The problem on the left is that clearly, absolutely, indisputably, if the right can go too far, and the evidence for that is the catastrophe, like the catastrophe of Auschwitz, the catastrophe of the Nazis, all that death and suffering is evidence of wrong, which is accepted by the left, then equal evidence exists that can happen on the left. In fact, perhaps even more evidence. And if you don't think the evidence is credible, then there's something wrong with you.
There's something that's gone wrong from the 20th century and is still going wrong on this. I think I've said to you before that there seems to be this presumption still, if this is a political centre, that if you take one step to the political right, say by wanting to have lower taxes, that makes you right-wing. And beyond that, it's just a vertiginous hurtle down to Nazism. It's lower taxes, alt-right Nazism.
Yeah.
And on the left of the spectrum, it's possible to step left, be on the left, run left, keep running, and the end of the running never includes the gulag.
Never. Not in the education systems either. No one knows about it. When my students at the University of Toronto, the first time they hear about what happened in the Soviet Union is in my personality class. It's like, well, what the hell? First of all, really, in a personality class? I mean, the reason I bring it up is because Solzhenitsyn drew an existential link between the failure of the individual psyche and the propensity for people to engage in the great lie and the creation of these totalitarian states. So I view it as an extension of existential psychology and philosophy, and that's how I slot it into my classes. But the students otherwise don't know. It's like, oh, really? We had 100 million corpses pile up and damn near put the entire planet to the torch because of the tension between the West and the radical left. And, well, we're just going to sweep that under the rug like it never happened. It's like, well, what? Okay, so then it's very easy to be extremely annoyed about this and even morally outraged, and it's hard to avoid the temptation. But there is actually a technical problem here, I think, and it's one that the right is perhaps just as incapable of solving. And this is the issue that you brought up. It's like, okay, exactly when do things go too far on the left? And the answer is, we don't know. And it might be because there isn't a single issue on the left that marks out the degeneration into pathological ideology, like claims of racial difference that support the notion of superiority do on the right. So maybe it's a pathological combination of 5 good ideas, something like that. Like, I believe now that there's a nexus of ideas that mark out the left as too extreme. Diversity, inclusivity, equity, it's kind of like a mantra. White privilege, that's not a phrase that I'm very fond of. And claims of, and exaggerated claims of systemic racism. It's something like that. So, as well as what would you call the verbiage around the oppressive patriarchy. Right. Jesus, that's a complicated box, and there's an interaction between all those terms because, well, you can make a case for diversity. Like, should all elementary school teachers be women? Well, perhaps not. Should all nurses be women? Perhaps not. Should all plumbers be men? Well, perhaps not. Like, you might.
Do you only have fairness when you have more female engineers?
Yes. Well, and to what if we're going to have a society where men and women are competing on a roughly equal basis? Do we want a situation where all the engineers are men? Perhaps not. And I mean, I don't know the answer to these questions because because choice matters. So each of these individual leftist propositions has a domain of reasonableness about it. And then it goes too far. And then the aggregation of them also goes too far, but we can't tell when.
And what makes it harder, it seems to me, is the issue of motive. That, the late Robert Conquest, as you know, one of the great historians of the nightmare that happened in Russia in the 20th century, was once asked late in life about this issue of the intrinsic evil of the 2 totalitarianisms of the 20th century. And I remember even Conquest found it hard to put his finger on it, but said, in some way the Nazis do seem worse. Yeah. And I've often thought about this, and I think the one thing you can't avoid that comes down to is there is some kind of intrinsic feeling that remains, that whereas the Nazi regime gets it wrong for horrible and the worst possible reasons, somehow every single time that the communists had control of a country and turned it into dust, it was somehow the product of good intention.
Yeah, well, there's a universalism about the communist ethos that definitely isn't there on the Nazi side, because the Nazi claim is, this is for us and definitely not for you. And so the exclusionary principle is built right into the beginning, right at the beginning. Whereas on the communist side, at least in principle, if not in reality, the coming utopia was for everyone. And there was the song of the brotherhood of man, and the idea that people could be included regardless of their origin. So that seems like part of it, is that there's an evil built into the principle itself that the Nazis that ran with, that is absent with the communists. But the truth of the matter is, to some degree, that it didn't matter because the tally of bodies was equivalent on both sides of the equation. And so even if there's the lack of a certain toxic principle at the outset of the communist doctrine, it doesn't make it one whit less catastrophic. And it might even be worse in some sense because you can't put your finger on it. Now, my sense is that a line crossed on the left is equality of outcome. And it's part of the identity politics pathology. There's something wrong with, first of all, there's something wrong with construing the world as if your group identity is paramount. That's bad. That's a non-starter. Now, it's not so easy to exactly say why.
Funnily enough, of course, that is being pushed currently on the left, but it will, as you said before, benefit the right parts of the right in the end.
Oh, definitely, and because there's just no reason for the right not to capitalize on that. It's perfectly.
There's an unbelievable own goal that's being created, a horrific goal opening down the road here.
Yes, definitely. Well,
we can all see it coming.
Well, as soon as you say, well, yes, your group identity is paramount, then you allow people who say, well, not only is it paramount, it's superior. Right. Well, that's not that much of a transformation of the perspective. especially when you're also saying to certain groups that you should be playing to lose. It's like, well, because anyone sensible is going to look at that and say, well, why shouldn't I play to win? If group identity is paramount, why shouldn't my group just win?
Those people you can identify as being on the far right these days, and the people that are, the few people that have got this massive press attention for being called alt-right, you notice one thing in particular with them: they flirt with the dangers of fascism. They flirt. You can see it when they're caught on video. They like to drop in terms that resonate. They flirt with fascism. They flirt with Nazism. And this is rightly something we pick up on, and our ears are attuned to it. In London, where we're sitting last week on a morning television chat show, a young woman who was invited on got into a row with the presenter, and he was portraying her because he supported Trump and she was anti-Trump. He said, well, you know, since you loved Obama so much, she said, I didn't love Obama, she says. And she says, I'm a communist. I didn't love Obama. I'm literally a communist, you idiot. And this, as we speak, has become not just enormously popular, but gigglesome on the left in this country. And I'm not talking about the far left. I'm talking about the left right up to and involved with Her Majesty's opposition. I'm literally a communist has just been made into a T-shirt by a group on the left, and they're selling it. And this in an era when we've been endlessly told, you know, the only thing you do if you see a fascist is to punch them in the face. And there seems to be, as I've always said, a supply and demand problem with the fascists. There aren't enough for the demand there seems to be to find them. But yet, here you have live on television, I'm literally a communist. And it's unimaginable. We all know it's unimaginable that somebody would say, I'm literally a fascist on TV, and everyone would find it wonderful, and everyone would make I'm literally a fascist T-shirts. So this 20th century era, this educational era, seems to me to be having real world consequences of a kind
catastrophe. It means that we learned half the lesson. We sort of learned half the lesson of the 20th century, right? And well, thank God we sort of learned half the lesson, but the other half has not been learned, and that's not acceptable, not in the least acceptable. Yeah, the idea that you can come, well, you know, the data in the United States indicates that 1 out of 5 social science professors are self-proclaimed Marxists. It's like, you're a Marxist? Really? Like, seriously? Yeah, not only am I a Marxist, it's one of the things that makes me morally virtuous. Well, what about the 20th century? Well, that wasn't real communism. It's like, and I know what that means. It's the most arrogant possible statement. What it means is that, well, you know, those people who tried it before, they didn't really have the same nuanced understanding of the sophistication of Karl Marx's revelation that I have, or the moral character that I have, so that if I had been placed in charge, let's say, of the Russian Revolution, the utopia, that was only a couple of decades away. That's what it means.
I once wrote about this with Eric Hobsbawm, the famous left-wing historian who just shortly before his death was asked in an interview by Michael Ignatieff that if it took another 20 million dead to have achieved full communism and the state he wanted, would it have been worth it? And he replied, yes, it would have been worth it. Again, unimaginable that this could happen in the opposite direction. But particularly unimaginable still this idea, even after the 20th century, that these Marxists, literally a communist people, still are standing on the piles of tens of millions of skulls saying a bit more violence and we might yet get to utopia. It's an extraordinary...
Always one murder away from utopia. One more murder away from utopia. Well, you know, and the way that the leftists defend themselves is by saying things like, well, what about all the deaths created by capitalism? You're not factoring them into the equation. And then, of course, the problem there is that most systems manifest themselves in various forms of bloody excess. And so how you tally up the bodies depends on where you draw the boundaries around your conceptual systems. And you know, if you include the entire history of the Western expansion into the New World, say, over the last 400 years, and you decide that that's a manifestation of Western capitalism, let's say, then, well, the tellies, I suppose, they look different.
And at the very least, you can say that the number of people raised out of poverty by capitalism is significantly higher than the number of people raised out of poverty by communism. Well,
this is. I think there's something crucial about that, because one of the things that we will have to contend with is something like that, which is that every system is, in some sense, a system of oppression and bloodshed. But some of them also produce a modicum of wealth and happiness. And I would say that that's the proper defense of what has been established as a consequence of the primacy of the individual in the conceptual schemes of the West, is our bloody oppressive system at least produces some modicum of wealth and well-being, whereas the communist system produced, if you're optimistic communist, no more deaths, which I believe is wrong, but zero wealth and a tremendous amount of collateral destruction. And so it could easily be that we're in a position where all we have to choose from is horrible systems, some of which do some things right now and then. And that would be our system. That would be the Western system. And I think there's plenty of evidence for that too, accruing evidence, because what's happening right now across the world is that as the idea of individual sovereignty and associated property rights and freedom of choice and so forth are increasingly instantiated in developing countries, those countries are moving away from conditions of abysmal poverty at a staggering rate. And so, like, the right-wing types have to admit that hierarchies do dispossess and that they have their elements of brutality about them. Even if they're functional hierarchies, even if they're competence predicated, they dispossess people. This is the cognitive problem in large part that's going to bedevil us over the next 20 years. But I mean, at least there are fewer people starving now. There are more people being lifted out of absolute poverty. Child mortality rates in Africa now match those in Europe in 1950. It's like, that's cause for celebration. And we have halved the number of people in absolute poverty since the beginning of the millennium. And so I think we have to grow up and be realistic and say, well, yes, there are, all human systems of governance and organization are pathological to some degree. But some of them are minimally functional as well.
An optimistic, pessimistic note on which to finish. Thank you.
Thank you.